So as we all file in, I just want to say that this is the second day of the climate dialogue um, series that we're doing, sponsored by Fetzer. And like we did yesterday, I'd like to take just a few moments of time to commemorate what's going on still down in Texas. Let's just take a 30-second period of silence for that, and we'll let the others kind of come on in as they do. Thank you. Okay, it looks like the bulk of us are here today. We're going to do something a little bit differently after I introduce the Climate Dialogue Group. But actually, before I do that, I'd like to get a raise of hands of people who are here for the first time, who were not here yesterday, just so I know. Okay, a few people have not been here yesterday. Not too many. Well, I'll keep it fairly short. I just wanted to say a little bit about how this whole climate dialogue series came to be. Around last August, several of us got together around a shared interest in what we're calling Bohm-inspired dialogue, and we also realized that we had a tremendous interest in how it might be helpful in the climate space. So we just kept talking about it, and we kept bringing in people to kind of help us think things through. And Richard Heinberg actually was known by one of our members. There's Richard over there in the corner. You might wave. He had just written a book called Power. I always have to look at the title because I can never remember the exact.
Limits and Prospects for Human Survival.
There you go. And it's a fabulous book, and it really got us confirmed in our thinking how important dialogue can play its role in creating what he calls more horizontal communication and power versus continual vertical power, which seems to be destroying our world right now. So that got us connected with some of the fielding folks, and I'm going to introduce all of us. We just kept meeting, and we kept thinking through how dialogue could be used to leverage conversations of importance so that the pretty siloed climate field could become a bit more aligned. Right now we have tens of thousands of great organizations out there all working in climate, but there's very little clear alignment in our messaging, in what needs to be done. So this is just the start of an effort to move in that direction. So I'm just going to point out who's on our core team, who got this whole thing started. Let's see, I'm trying to find everybody here on the screen. John, our moderator, I can't even see you. Can you raise your, oh, you're right next to me.
Those members might wave also, Linda, just so pick them out in case everybody doesn't know them.
Yes, okay. We've got Nancy Glock-Grunite. She's our newest member. She's right there in the second row. I don't see Peter yet. Peter Whitehouse, he was supposed to be here. He's called our tree doctor. I don't see him yet. Rick Lathrop's here. Why don't you raise your hand? He was actually very important in our initial days. He knew all of us and brought us kind of all together. I see Anna Factor somewhere. She's here. I just don't see. There she is. She's in the little tiny picture. And then we've got our two fielding guys. David Blake, why don't you say a few things, David Willis?
Welcome everyone to our fielding Social Ecological Justice Week, DEI Week, and these are all being recorded. All the sessions are being recorded, so you'll have access to them later. As someone shared with us yesterday, from Thomas Berry, we have the opportunity to tell a new story. So this is our goal here.
Thanks, David. And I see Rick Moody, to wave your hand. And finally, we have the other Fielding representative. I just can't find him.
Rich
John
Applebaum.
Applebaum. He's somewhere. Oh, he's right below you.
Center.
There he is.
Center screen.
Why don't you say a few words, Rich?
Well, yesterday was absolutely terrific. 3 hours of dialogue and then follow-up. I didn't think I would survive that long being in front of a computer, but it worked out great. So I really look forward to this morning.
All right, thanks, Rich. So we're going to try something a little bit differently today. Yesterday, what we learned for the first time, of course, is that Zoom can only highlight 9 people, and we have more panelists than we can highlight. So what we're going to do today is we're going to ask you, if you're not on the panel, to simply turn your camera off. That way, those of us who will be participating in the fishbowl dialogue will stand out. So we'll ask you to do that right now. And I'm going to then introduce the panel. What's going to happen after that is John, our moderator, will go through a PowerPoint presentation on what makes dialogue different from other forms of conversation. We'll move into dialogue. John's got some great opening questions for us. Yesterday we focused on sort of waking up, what really are the problems? How did we get here? And today we're going to move more into solutions. What can we do? Who needs to talk to whom? How can we use dialogue to advantage? All right, I appreciate that. So most of us are going to be up at the top of the screen because as we speak, we'll be kind of located up there. So you'll have a better fishbowl experience. And those of you who are in the who are watching this, who are participants, your role today, until you get into the breakouts, are to watch what goes on here, because this form of conversation is different and we want you to kind of just absorb it. And we'll ask you in the breakout groups, what did you observe that was a little bit different from what you normally find in other webinars or other such presentations on climate? Okay, so I'm just going to go across my screen. So today we're bringing Skip Leitner into the conversation. Skip and I know each other from Tucson. He is an economist and he's teaching at the University of Arizona right now, sustainability. We just talked to David Willis, who's a Fielding professor in sustainability. I've introduced Richard Heinberg already. He's an author. He's also the founder of the Post-Carbon Institute and has been studying sustainability and power for a very long time. Tatiana is from Ukraine. She's an alum, Fielding an alum, and she's also a peace activist. Nicola is a civil rights lawyer, I believe, Fielding grad. Let's see, Nancy Glock-Gruneit is also an acquaintance of mine, and she's been a climate activist for many, many years. Harvard grad, and she's extremely brilliant, and we're so happy to have her on our team. Let's see, going across.
Allison Davis White Eyes, who's on the other screen, by the way, but
Yes.
maybe she can.
Yes, Allison, why don't you say a few things about
Please.
yourself? I know you're the Chief Diversity Officer, right, at Fielding?
Yes, I am the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Fielding Graduate University, and I'm just happy to be here and had a wonderful experience yesterday.
Wonderful.
So glad to have you back, Allison.
And Nicola, do you want to say a few things about yourself?
Nicola.
Nicola.
Yes, I can say a few words. One, I'm under false pretenses. I wish I were a civil rights attorney, and in fact, that's an area that I'm expressing more now than previously, because I did a lot of corporate and judicial work in my earlier iteration, Linda. But I am glad to be welcomed and delighted to be here and look forward to this dialogue being as good as yesterday.
Wonderful. Well, we're glad that you're here as well. And David Albert, can you say a few things about you? I know you do water activism work, but I'm sure you can explain it a little bit better than I can. And you're on mute.
Thank you, Linda. My name is David Albert. I am the co-founder of Friendly Water for the World, and I have been working in and throughout the developing world, sub-Saharan Africa, and India for almost 50 years. David Blake Willis and I met in 1973, we're almost at our 50th anniversary. I'm known as the older David. He's the younger one because he's 3 months younger. I work on regenerative practices with very, very, very poor communities throughout sub-Saharan Africa and India. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. They have something to say to us, which has so far been missing in this dialogue. This is an interesting experience for me. I don't go to many academic things. I go to almost no seminars of this kind. I spend 90 to 95% of every day with only people who are people of color throughout the world. So seeing so many non-people of color in one place is interesting for me. I'm usually the token in the conversations that I'm in, and that makes for interesting things too. And I'm delighted that all of you have taken the time and energy to put this together, and you've all become part of me. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Linda, let me just ask Diane, who is our behind the scenes tech guru, if there's a way of bringing the panelists onto the front screen. I noticed that Allison is still on the second screen, and so as is probably, let me see anybody else on the panel.
Actually, I think they're all in the first two lines, John. The first two.
Allison is still on the second page.
No, actually on my screen she isn't, but I suppose every screen's different. That's the challenge.
Oh boy. Okay.
But everybody else is, we've asked everyone else to turn their video off, and I think they have for the most part. So I think we're ready to go. I don't have a whole lot more to say. You can use the chat if you'd like to for messages or anything like that. We are going to spend a little bit of time at the very end showing you how you can stay in touch with everyone through a website portal that John and I just developed. So just look forward to that. So you don't have to feel like you have to put your names and all of that in the chat, although we will save the chat and somehow get that to you at the end. And you also will have the recording, of course. Okay, John, I think I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about what dialogue is all about.
Great. Thank you, Linda. Thank you for this introduction. And thank you all for being here. We had a pretty remarkable day yesterday, and we found that the nature of Bohm dialogue became an organic part of our process. I'm going to give, many of you were here yesterday, but for those who weren't, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what this, in a PowerPoint, in terms of how to understand Bohm dialogue. So this is just a kind of a quick overview of what this process is about. First of all, there's a distinction to be made between discussion and dialogue. And discussion is our most typical form of communication. We get together and discuss ideas and points of view and that sort of thing. And it's about advocating often. We're often advocating for what we know, what we've learned, all that. It can devolve into debates, ping pong topics, often data driven. It's often left brain driven, if you will. Frequent objective, if you will, of how is my point of view winning? And that's kind of the difficulty of discussion versus dialogue, which is really a totally different way of communicating, deep listening to all views, really seeking meaning across those differences so that we've suspended our judgments, if you will. And in the nature of dialogue, all win because we're doing our thinking together. So Bohm dialogue yields shared meanings, new solutions by building on the themes that are emerging in the dialogue. Here's just a quick schematic of the key points, the key practices, if you will. First of all, suspending judgments, suspending those things that we're certain of, and how to recognize that we want to be on even playing field and coming into the discussion, being willing to learn and maybe change or even change our point of view. Let me go back. Then there's the identifying assumptions. A lot of the time, assumptions are the things that we've held for maybe many years that actually inform our judgments. It's a different layer, if you will, but it's important that our assumptions be identified in a group so that we know where each other's coming from. Listening and inquiring at 4 levels, and I'll explain each of these in a bit more detail, but listening is really the heart of dialogue. In so many cases, our discussions are where our minds are formulating responses and we're not listening. We're getting ready to debate or getting ready to retort. We're listening for the deeper voice in each of us, and that, if you will, that intimate voice, that private, that maybe even vulnerable voice that allows us to connect. And speaking to the center, it's an age-old practice, certainly in the Native American world, that the council circle, everyone would speak to the center of that circle. We find there's an organic difference when you speak to the center as opposed to just retorting with each other. And so those are the key fundamentals. Suspending judgments is we're coming in with a lot of judgments of others' positions, judgments that we have. And this is about leaving our guns at the door, if you will. And so being willing to have your mind changed. And we can only do that if we open up. We've spent our lives becoming certain about so many things. This is an opportunity to replace that certainty, even your skepticism, with curiosity. It's if we enter this process with curiosity about what each other is bringing, then something really different happens. Identify those assumptions. Be willing to disclose the assumptions that are driving your own statements and your judgments. And they may be lifelong assumptions that we need to examine. And if you're not sure what the assumptions that might be driving others' statements, just inquire. Help me understand the assumption that might be leading your thoughts. Listening and inquiring, and this is really the heart, if you will, and it's multitasking in terms of our listening, if you will. Listening to others deeply versus planning a response. Empty your mind of what I'm going to say differently. Listen to yourself, your own feelings, thoughts as you're listening to each other. How do we listen to ourselves? Certainly listening to the group. And the output of Bohm dialogue is finding shared meaning and the eventual thinking together that might occur in that. And so as we find that shared meaning in a kind of a rhythm organically, it brings us to some collective thinking, which leads to resolutions that we may never have imagined otherwise. And listening to the silence. It's perfectly okay to have silence between speakers so that the words can resonate and settle in of the last speaker. We need to honor what somebody else has said, and that pause between statements is the way we honor that. Finding your own voice. It's the inner voice. It's the right brain, probably more so than our left brain, which is organizing all kinds of data. But what is the imagination that comes into our right brain, and trusting that voice, which seems called to speak, not just as a retort or repartee, but that thing that's really coming from deeper within you. In many cases, just opening your mouth, you may be surprised what you're going to say. Speak as the Spirit moves you. Speak to the center. There's something really different that happens when you speak to the center of the circle versus responding to individuals. And if there's a need for a clarifying question, ask that question of the circle. You might find somebody else will answer it other than the person who you might have been directing that to. So that's kind of the framework for how we can operate in this fishbowl, if you will, of the panelists. And in a in a safe container, if you will, that is where we can speak for who we are and speak our deepest thoughts and appreciate and honor those thoughts. For the attendees those of you who are, whoops, I lose that screen. Hang on a second. For the attendees, sorry. Hope you can see that. Again, in observing the Bohm dialogue, notice the examples of how this process differs from most discussion-based meetings. Notice what the new meanings are that have emerged for you and how you might build on those in dialogue.
John, we're no longer seeing your screen, just so you know.
Not seeing this screen. No. Why is that not the case? Let me go back to share screen. All right, I don't know why that dropped off. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay. So for those attendees who are not in the panelists, notice the examples. See what you're noticing about how this process unfolds. Notice what the new meanings are that have emerged for you. And all right, I'm going to stop that share at this point and come back to gallery view, full screen. And are we back in gallery view?
Yeah, and John, we have one more panelist arrive. I just want to introduce him.
Okay.
Robert Corman. He is sitting on the board of a company called A Growing Culture, and he knows a lot about the bad things, unfortunately, with respect to industrial ag. So he's here now. Thanks.
All right, great. So for the panelists, and we have 11 panelists this morning, and so one of the challenges for me is be able to recognize you. And when you do have a question or want to participate, once we've gotten through the check-in, all you need to do is give me a wave. If I don't see it, Linda may see it, and we'll make sure that you're recognized. The way this is going to go, I'm going to offer a check-in question. So each of the panelists will have 60 seconds, no more, 60 seconds or less, to give a response to that check-in question. It's the one thought that comes off your mind, and I'll give you that question in a second. Following that 60-second each check-in, we'll go into the full dialogue, and we'll ask another question that will kind of guide the dialogue. What we know about dialogue in its best sense is it takes on a life of its own. So this is not a restrictive question, but as it evolves and you're speaking deeply from what you feel and believe, it will evolve. At the end of, and just 15 minutes before the end of the session, which will be about 12:35, we'll do a check out question, and also which will be kind of like, what have you witnessed? What have you experienced? What has stood out for you? So let me do this. I'm going to give you the check-in question to begin with, and then we're going to ask you to take 30 seconds of silence just to let that check-in question resonate with you, and asking your inner self, if you will, how you might respond. So here's the check-in question. And the panel yesterday, we were dealing with waking up and recognizing the issue. Today, our headliner is next steps. Where are we going from here? And how is dialogue going to help transport us? So, and it's still all about climate. So the check-in question is, what is your deepest hope for climate crisis resolution? What is your deepest hope? Not just what you think and what your bleeding proposals are, but what is your deepest hope? Let's take 30 seconds just to let that resonate, and then we'll start with the check-in. All right, that may not be nearly enough time to wrestle with that question. But I'm going to start off the round, and I'm going to call on people as we go through for the panelists. So, Richard Heinberg, I'm going to call on you first because you have had such a life of so many different dimensions in climate change. But what is that one deepest hope that you have?
Right. Well, my deepest hope is that somehow together we as humanity can realize that we're headed toward a cliff, and economic growth is unequal growth, but also just total economic growth of humanity is pushing us toward that cliff. So my greatest hope is that we can find together a peaceful, equitable, cooperative way down the ladder of power so that we get off of this juggernaut toward the cliff of doom and extinction.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to go down the list and I'm going to call on Skip Leitner. Skip, what is your deepest hope for resolution for this climate crisis resolution? 60 seconds.
Good question. And picking up on what Richard just said, I'm an international resource economist. I think of myself as a closet sociologist, trying to meld our social economic well-being with the geologic ecosystem services, because we're not only at a cliff economically and socially, but our physical well-being is at risk. So my deepest hope is that we handle and deal with not just climate, but what I call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We've got the pandemic because we've been pushing the urban wildlife interface so hard with the zoonotic leaps. Yes, we've got climate, which is a huge problem, a serious burden, but we've also got a slow eroding of the economy, perhaps something along the line what Richard might be saying. But finally, we have so many injustices, whether sexual, racial, income, environmental justices. So we can't deal only with climate. We painted ourselves into a geologic corner that says we have to deal with all four of the horsemen at the same time if we're going to move ahead past our current cliff.
Yeah, it's not an isolated issue.
Not an isolated issue.
Certain, right. Thank you, Skip. Allison Davis Whiteeyes, what is your deepest hope?
As a DEI specialist, I would say my deepest hope is that we understand, honor, and act on the interrelatedness of all things. And I think that we have not done that. And I would agree with Skip that everything, all of these issues that are confronting us now that were laid bare during this COVID-19 pandemic, were really an opportunity for us to reset all of our reference points. And the question is, how are we going to do that reset so we can then move forward? And I think, part of that is really shifting the way that we think. And I would say my biggest hope out of all of this is that we choose life, over death, that we choose eros over thanatos, that we think about the ways that life is sacred. And I think in doing that, we bring everyone together for the benefit of the world. So that's what my hope is.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Robert Corman. Is Robert on,
Yes.
Linda? Okay.
Yes.
I am here.
Where are you?
Thank you, John. So I'm a professional generalist. My career has been from law to philanthropy to coaching, and I'm very much involved in the issues of industrial agriculture. My greatest hope is that climate and other things that tell us that we're on the edge can be seen for what they are: symptoms of unjust distribution of power, and the continuation of that failure to see what really controls the future has to be the very thing that can be changed. And I'm seeing hope around the world. And to me, the capacity for that hope to be seen by others and worked across sectors is going to me one of the things that can really help us see positive outcomes that we're looking for.
Thank you, Robert. Linda Eleanor.
Thanks, John. Well, I guess my deepest hope is that suddenly the world just gets it. I listened to a little podcast earlier today and learned that the premier of Australia was put into office just 3 days ago, and they put him into office because he represents hope for Australia. They finally made a commitment to turn towards renewable energy. That's amazing, since they're one of the largest exporters of coal and fossil fuels. So I kind of see that as maybe the beginning of the light, kind of like in systems theory. Suddenly there's just this huge change. People say, okay, we've got to do this systemically. We've got to have the governments involved, and suddenly it just happens worldwide. So that's my deepest hope right now, as we follow Australia's example.
Thank you, Linda. Nicola.
My deepest hope is that we overcome our history, and by so doing, that we learn something, that we solve this problem. And as our road to solving it is going to require us to be different, that we can be that difference that Richard spoke of, Robert, Alice, and Linda. And that is that we reconnect with each other, that we arrive at a model that will allow us to relate to each other around a focus in a manner that emancipates us from some of these injustices, such that going forward, our solution of future problems won't be so hobbled by our own selfishness, our own greed, and our own solipsism.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm sorry.
Don't even worry about it. It's American versus British pronunciation.
Thank you. David Alpert.
So I'm going to start at a different place, but don't worry, I'll get there. The first thing I need to do when I go to something like this is I like to acknowledge that this virtual communication conference is made possible by the labor of the people of the Congo, including tens of thousands of Black African child slaves, mining coltan and cobalt and other materials for our cell phones and computers. Without them, this conference doesn't happen. Now, you might think that was a red herring, but it's not. I was called out of the meeting late yesterday. I had to leave because one of my colleagues in the Congo, who has an orphanage for 70 war orphans and AIDS rape victims, and hundreds of thousands of rape victims in a town called Minova, reported that because of ongoing conflict, mostly over the coltan, there were 75,000 refugees created yesterday as a force, a so-called guerrilla force armed by Rwanda is approaching the city of Goma with 2 million people. And the coltan trade is centered in the town of Goma. And he, nonetheless, had to go from Minova to Goma because his wife, who's there with 3 children, likely has breast cancer. So in the middle of this conflict, he just needed a listening ear. So I guess I was modeling dialogue, but just not on this site. I'll have more to say later about my friends all over sub-Saharan Africa and India. But the thing, my greatest hope is that we find a way to listen to them. Thank you.
The listening is so critical, and it's so infrequently done in our nation and around the world, isn't it? So, Tatiana.
So my deepest hope is that we come to a realization as individuals, as communities, and as societies, that we have this deep and embedded traumatic patterns running in us and often running unconsciously, unacknowledged, unspoken, that traumatized individual in pain and in suffering, and emotional suffering can be as painful and as bad as physical. Individual in suffering and pain will create suffering communities, and suffering communities will create suffering societies, and will create suffering worldviews or traumatized worldviews. And from that, everything looks like as adaptation or coping mechanism to soothe our trauma patterns. So the end of story is, how can we recognize this and recognize our collective needs to connect and heal and start reversing this pattern, this upward pattern of traumatization, and creating monstrous creatures out of traumatized pattern. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. And it's so good to have you back again. And as we're experiencing trauma, outrageous trauma in this country at this point, no one on the planet has experienced trauma as much as your countrymen in Ukraine. And, that's front of heart for so many of us, and it's traumas all around us. Nancy Glock, Greenwich.
My greatest hope, as I hear the hopes of each of you and the resonance, is that most of the people I work with are the age of my grandchildren, in their around 30, give or take 10 years. And the quality of insight and leadership that they bring is extraordinary. And the leadership from Africa, from South America, from Asia, South Asia, the people who are actually in the front lines of this, with the courage to face it, and way beyond hope to act strongly in and around it. And the emergence, as is described in John Alexander's new book, Citizen, the description, knowing, looking at what is actually already surfacing. In his case, this is looking at emergent ways of dialogic democracy that is empowered and that is taking shape, kind of like mycelia. It's under the surface, we're not seeing it. So to be looking for that, and it is fusing with the climate movement. So the climate movement is not just a movement to address climate issues directly, but the recognition that our society not only must be changed, but in fact is changing, to see and acknowledge and build on that.
Thank you, Nancy. Quick question to Linda. I don't see Steve Redmond on this panel, so he's not with us. Thank you for that check-in, and that sets a framework for all of the hopes that we're facing, and not just in climate crisis, but around the world, in terms of how we recognize the complexity of what we're facing in the world at this point, and so many different crises. So I'm going to open the dialogue at this point, and in this case, anyone is free to start, and I'm going to try to keep my eyes on whose hand is up and find that order. But given the fact that we've got 10 panelists, just be attentive to your own airtime, and so that we get enough rounds to hear really deeply from each other and see what these emerging shared meanings are in this area. Here's the second question, to just in the scope of where do we go from here? Is what action, if you will, is beginning to surface for us in terms of, if you will, those next steps. And so here's the question for the dialogue. And if you need to answer another question, it's all dialogue, all right? So what are the critical issues that we're not exploring in this conversation and have not been explored in the global conversation about climate crisis? What are those critical issues that are not being explored? And a second part of that, the follow-up question is, who needs to be brought together in this discussion, in this broader dialogue, in order to find more alignment? So you can answer either or both of those questions. And David, you can lead off.
I wanted to start because we'll begin with the absolute most general solution, and then we can get to specifics. So as I've said, I work with people in sub-Saharan Africa and India. I have friends in Tanzania, Maasai women, who used to walk only 9 hours every night to collect water for their family, but because of global climate change are now walking 13 hours a day. They leave at 11 p.m. and return to their homes at 12 noon the next day with their 8 or 9-year-old daughters, who they take out of school for that purpose. And everything else in their lives has to be accomplished in those other 11 hours. And if they don't go out for water, there's no water for the family. I work with the families in India where entire villages are being abandoned because there's no water. The wells have all failed, the catchments have all failed, the heat is 49 degrees Celsius, and they're literally picking up their entire villages and leaving, usually living in sewer pipes on the edges of cities which are expanding. And I was imagining a conversation I would be having with my friends, specifically the Maasai women that I know in central Tanzania, and saying, okay, so you know that what's happening to you is because of climate change. And they would say, well, yeah, right. I mean, like, we live this, we know it. We know what's happening to us. You have a fancy name for it, but we know that there's not enough water. And when we get water, we get floods. And when we don't get water, we've got drought and the animals are dying, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would try to explain all the things that go into making climate change what it is. And they would probably stop me in the middle of the conversation and look me in the eye and say, well, why don't you stop it? That's as simple as it is. I'm with Richard Heinberg on this one. And basically, yeah, I don't have an answer for her. I don't have an answer for her. She didn't do anything to create this climate change. She was not part of any of this. We have her walking 13 hours a day for water, and it's because of something that happened here. I don't like using the word we, because most of us were not individually responsible. But here I am on a panel with highly educated and sometimes well-paid academics and writers and teachers and philanthropists and whatever. And we talk very well. But I'd like you to go meet some of my friends in central Tanzania and have them ask you this question. Stop it. And I'll stop.
Thank you, David. Robert Corman.
I feel a kinship with David, spending time in Africa and elsewhere. And I think the we is an important issue, because the we is primarily what we have bought into. What we have bought into is a reason for our comfort, which we go along with, while those in the global South, who can teach us enormously about the very things that we need to do when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to how we can fuel ourselves, the two biggest causes of climate change. We have to understand that climate change is really about power. Those friends in there, and some of my friends in Uganda or in Philippines, wherever there is land and there are resources, and David made this wonderful comment about why we wouldn't be here but for, those resources are truly in the hands of the few. And I don't mean the hands of just people in the North. I'm talking about the big corporations that are truly the cause of industrial agriculture providing much less of the food on 70% of the land that's arable in this world, 30% of the foods produced on 70% of the land that they control. Well, 70% of the food is produced on 30% of the land by farmers and peasants and indigenous people. And the reason this is so is because of the control over land, which is really ultimately a kind of theft. So this has been going on for 400 and 500 years. And now it's up to this younger generation, which my friend Nancy talked about. You can see the Prime Minister of Sweden meeting with Zelensky today. They're both the very people she's talking about, young people, and they're courageously looking at hard answers. So I just think it's important not to think about the soil and the carbon. They're critical symptoms. The issue is, what's the economics behind it? Where's the eco and economy? We really need to understand those issues as well.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Robert. Richard Heinberg.
Thank you, Robert, for mentioning power, because that's I agree that that is the key to understanding the human condition this century. For the last 7,000 years, some of humanity has developed hierarchical power structures, and that part of humanity gradually took over just about everyone else. And then in the last 200 years, through fossil fuels, we've gained access to vast amounts of energy that has made it possible for us to do things that were unimaginable before. Our population has grown 8 times over per capita consumption, land use, food production, on and on and on. So we're at a point now where we're seeing the symptoms, first of all, of too much human power over nature, and second, too much power of some people and organizations over everybody else. The solution, I think, has got to come, and here's my answer to this question: who needs to be part of this discussion? We have to form an anti-collapse coalition, because this excess and maldistribution of power is leading us to collapse this century unless we do something. So an anti-collapse coalition between whom? Well, certainly people interested in social justice and economic justice, both global and within nations, anti-war and peace activists, people who are interested in that issue, environmental protection, encompassing climate change, obviously, but also biodiversity, pollution of all kinds, depletion of natural resources, everything from minerals to forests. Those who are interested in building alternatives, alternative food systems, alternative economic ideas around cooperative institutions, eco-villages, energy alternatives, transition towns, and finally, indigenous people and those who are interested in protecting not only the culture of indigenous peoples, but their very survival in many cases. You know, I think these are the main elements of an anti-collapse coalition, and we're all pushing in the right direction. It's just that sometimes we don't all talk the same language and we don't talk to each other. And together, I think we have at least the possibility of turning the tide. So I'm delighted that about the possibility of using dialogue to bring together all of these folks so that we can see what we have in common and work together.
That's totally right on what our inclination is, Richard, and you've been part of this conversation, of course, is what is the opportunity for this practice of dialogue? Is it deep listening to each other, listening to the differences, listening across differences, so that we can find where that shared meaning is, so we can go forward together. And we, as Linda mentioned, there are tens of thousands of silos that are operating independently in many cases. But this notion of how do we speak together? So important. Nancy Glock.
Yeah, I want to build on what all three have said so far. If we think of the body politic as having different functions as an organic system does, all the sectors, each of them is part of the problem. Each of them are potentially part of the solution. New ways of doing economics, new ways of doing food, water, housing, energy, as well as social power, decision-making, collaborative problem solving. The answers to these are emerging in each of those sectors around the world. So this image of us coming together in an anti-collapse coalition, it seems to me what's even more, and if I may say even, I don't see us as siloed so much as not yet realizing how that we exist. Really seeing ourselves for what it is, seeing the emerging new movement that is potentially there. And the good news is that it may be that as we are forced to deal with these things and recognize the power we have, our agency and our compassion and humanity with each other, that we will make the changes needed in the right direction. That's the positive vision. The negative vision is that the collapse will occur in time, that we will lose our power to destroy the earth before we destroy it. And even then, these emergent possibilities are still present to us. So there's kind of a continuum along the way in which things are, much is going to get bad no matter what we do, but potentially there may be these emergent possibilities that surface because they have to, in confronting the kinds of issues that people in Africa are already confronting. And we, quote, we at the moment, the we I'm talking about is the privilege of the industrialized world. That's a sardonic notion of privilege, by the way, but we have choices, of limited choices, is that the seas will rise, the seaports will fail, our supply lines, we are in some ways far more fragile, far more fragile. Our supply lines will disappear, our shelves will be empty, and we will suddenly be in as bad a shape as many of the other nations that are already facing this. So there's something about that impending disaster that we actually share, along with an arising sense of relationship and connection, greater in some ways than perhaps we've had before with each other, and now reclaiming our sense of connection with nature, because nature is, it's clear that the planet is making the moves that will deprive us of the power to destroy her. In that lies my greatest hope. And the vision of that coalition that you spoke of, Richard, is very palpable at this point. The ideal is to look for it and see it and name it. And in that we are talking, that's kind of the basis of our talking with each other.
Such a key question and point that you raise in terms of relationship, the broader relationship, and even the relationship with with nature at this point as co-equals on this planet. Linda.
Yes, I'd like to just notice that Dr. Stephen Redmond is with us. He is on our panel. Stephen, if you can unblock your video and join us, John will bring you into the conversation with the question that we're kind of pondering right now.
Hi, Stephen. Yes, great to have you. You are obviously on the road someplace.
Well, I'm not driving. I'm in a safe place. I could take my seatbelt off. I'm actually just sitting on the side of the road and listening. I just left George Washington University. But right now, I wanted to just listen. And I am drawn to some of the work that the UN is doing in the UN's 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And what was striking to me is just in listening to what was going on right now, all of you, I want to nominate all of you for to be on that UN panel, because it's just amazing how your minds, your hearts, and your spirits have hit all of those points that are being discussed at a global level. And so I just wanted to tell you, I appreciate that. I don't have anything to add at this point, but it's I think that's just commendable. I'm appreciating it, and I'm looking for those pieces that are not covered, but I think that you're covering all of them. If there was anything I wanted to add, it would be that for my own personal take on this, I think it's a hugely important part of what we're doing to take the dialogue and, again, nothing profound, but do our very best to put into action within ourselves the things that we're doing. It's been said, the colloquialism is to walk the talk. It's just I think it's very profound at how many people actually look at what we're doing and not what we're saying. And
Right.
so as we do this dialogue, and I know all of you, including myself, we're doing those things. And I just want to just encourage us to continue to do that. Don't think this is a waste of the time. And also be gentle with ourselves as we move forward with dialogue that we may not always be living up to, and continue that fight.
Stephen, thank you. We have initiated some questions that you may not have heard in terms of this process. And the first check-in question was, what is our deepest hope for climate resolution? Deepest hope. And the other, and we're in the midst of the dialogue, the basic dialogue at this point. And what are the critical issues that are not being addressed, and who needs to be in this conversation? So happy to have you enter in from as you like, and we're going to continue on with that question in this group in the interest of dialogue, where we're conscious of our airtime and conscious of wanting to listen to each other's deepest voice.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. If I would add one word or one sentence without taking a deep dive, it would be sustainable urban development. I'll leave it there. The numbers speak for themselves. We're already at 2022, and all of the latest research is showing that, we're going to have to accommodate 5 billion people or more in urban areas by 2030. And that's just 8 years from now. And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. David Alpert.
So the people I work with are, my direct contacts are with activists and movers and shakers and development people. But the people we work with, they're not part of these conversations. They're not activists. They live in their communities. I'm thinking particularly of one community we work in where the average income is about $1.50 a day. And that's when they have rain. And when we go into a community, before we do anything, we hold a long community engagement process, minimum 3 days, usually 5 days. And we have particular technologies that we can offer, but it's not about technologies. We want to know what the people we want to work with, what they want. And we'll spend up to 3 days trying to suss out that answer. So I had one community in Northwest Kenya where 200 people showed up for the first day of community engagement, representing 10 villages. None of the village leaders in any of those 10 villages, they were only 4 miles apart, had ever met each other before. And then there was a village area chief. I think may have been government appointed, I don't know. But after, he thought he'd come for a half hour, and he stayed for all 3 days. And afterwards, he said, you know, I've been doing this job for 17 years. We've had all kinds of NGOs come and go, and plop their stuff on us, and all kinds of development experts have come and plopped their stuff on us, and then they go away. We don't know why they came, and we don't know why they left. And in 17 years, not a single development organization had ever asked us what we want. That's quite a commentary. Now, it's pretty much like that in the US now, although we cover it over with, you know, our democratic trappings. But, you know, we never even get to talk about what do we want as families and communities. You know, we're all working to make more money, but for what? What is it? What is it? Are we working for, why do we work in universities? Is it for more prestige? I mean, what is it that we really want? And does anybody really care? I think we just have to ask those kinds of questions. Now, we use a technique called Appreciative Inquiry. It looks very much like a Bohmian dialogue. In that we just have to talk to people and make it possible for people to talk to each other. The idea of people, you know, in the US, I mean, we no longer go to the polls anymore. Now it's all done by mail. We don't, so my state, we don't go to the polls. We don't have regular gatherings. The local newspaper has virtually disappeared. I mean, it's just a 2-page ad sheet. It used to be a 20-page newspaper. It's a 2-page ad sheet, and they're always bankrupt. The media access has dried up almost totally. We don't have the opportunity to talk with each other anymore. And when you add in the vicissitudes of life in the communities in which I work, it happens even less. So anything that gets us talking to each other is a big.
And that's so much about of what we're about. I'm interested in Allison's thoughts on, just from the standpoint of the Native American population in this country and the journey. But how do we hear that voice? How do we bring together the Native population in terms of those?
Well, so first I would say we actually have an individual who was supposed to be on the panel today, and I don't see them. That was Miranda Haskey. And I really, yes, Miranda would really be the best person to speak to that. And I think especially because of the situations that the Navajo Nation itself has faced over decades. And I certainly don't want to speak in her stead. But what I wanted to share was the importance of really making sure we bring in diverse voices and experiences about this. And this is where the DEI lens is so important, because when we're talking about environmental justice, it is so intricately tied into social and, yes, racial justice and the justice for underserved and underrepresented communities. And we have to begin to really shift our lens so that we are more inclusive of those voices and those experiences. I think to your point, John, you know, indigenous communities, and indigenous doesn't mean just Native Americans in North America. There's indigenous communities all over the world. David is working with indigenous communities in Africa. So we need to have that voice and perspective raised up and be a part of what I loved the comment around coalition building. These broad coalitions that are working towards something together, and especially around this climate challenge that we have. I think, you know, and to your first question about critical issues not being explored, I would say the question I have for us as a critical issue that I don't think is being explored is, what are we willing, we meaning the privileged, which is everybody in this call, anybody who lives in North America right now, for the most part. And I mean, there's degrees of that, but for the most part, what are we willing to give up? And what are we willing to change? And what are we willing to share? And I think this goes to Richard Heinberg's point about power. We really have to have a critical examination of power and be willing to confront and reflect on and act on how we have constructed power and what it is doing to those communities that really lack representation and voice in this whole situation that we're in. So I think that is how I would answer that question. I'm hoping Miranda can join us, because I really think her story and perspective would be invaluable.
Thank you. Yes, and Miranda was an amazing contributor yesterday. I hope we can have her back. Nicola.
Yes, I love what I am hearing, and I am thinking deeply, trying to listen hard and harder and reach down for things that we're not yet saying, but that are in the back of our minds, at least as I am hearing it. And that is the anti-collapse coalition, the inclusivity, but I'm going to take, or force myself to take, a more contrarian view. Because you heard me say at the beginning, I didn't want to be here under false pretenses as a civil rights lawyer. My work has been with the powerful. It's what's allowed me to have feeling as a last career. And I saw in the chat, another philanthropist without money. How do we attract them to this coalition of, inclusive people so that our voices get heard by them in terms of meaningful changes that can be made to stop us from the cliff, but to attract them to the conversation? I believe we have to look at market segmentation. The appeals that will bring the people who can make that difference are very different from what appeals will bring others who have traditionally been outside of the discussion or the dialogue. And I just want to say, because this comes up in my course in structural inequality and diversity, when you read the literature on who owns the world and who controls the world, and when you read how frightened the researchers are of their own findings, and how they dance around it, you're talking about an extremely small and getting smaller group. But one thing I will say that I find helps is some of what we talked about yesterday. Rich Applebaum brought that up in terms of capitalism. I think we have to grasp that nettle and say, how do we deal with capitalism that is still the foundational economic system of the world, in a way to turn it around to serve the interests of those of us who want to see both a more equitable distribution of resources, but then not see us go over the edge in the way that that Nancy spoke of and that Robert and Richard spoke of. The one thing I have had any success with on that, and I'll leave with this, is you're ruining capitalism to allow it to run wild in the pernicious and predatory way that we have, takes it off the table as a tool. That guarantees collapse, whereas it could be used as an instrument to preserve it. Because to get people who are very wealthy out of the lifeboat mentality that they have now, which is, I'll have enough money that whatever happens, I'll survive. Thank you. I'll stop.
Yeah.
Powerful, Nicola. Thank you for that. Linda.
I'm just listening to this conversation. It takes me back to what I said in the very beginning. I think we keep tap dancing around the fact that we have an elite. Certainly, this is why I love Richard's book. We have this elite structure that just will not let go. They don't want to be regulated by government. They will continue the entire world's death march if somehow we don't stop it. So I like the idea very much that you had expressed, Richard, and others, of this anti-collapse coalition. But where's the power? I mean, somehow there has to be power built on that side of the equation to stand up to the power that's in place. And I don't know how to build that. I don't know who are the most important people who have the kind of power that can stand up to the power we have. I think if we start to watch governments like Australia, and they actually start to give us a model for how they turn things around, that's where I'm kind of placing some of my hope. But I'm very curious if any of you have other ideas of, who could start such an anti-collapse coalition that already wields power.
Yes, and how to get the recognition that the power of dialogue amongst those that are in that power structure,
Right.
who are only maybe listening to their stockholders and their close friends, et cetera. How do we break into that? How do we get that recognition that this is a critical step? We're at a pivotal point, and only when we talk together in deep ways like you are can this change. Richard.
I don't have any easy answers to that question, but it's a really, really important question to ask. And my suggestion is only that there are a lot of us who are generally interested in one or another of these issues, sometimes two or three, and deeply concerned about them. And even the people high up in the power structures in government and corporations are a little worried about climate change and the results of too much economic inequality on, the economy as a whole, which is what buoys them up to the top of the social pyramid. But of course, the solutions that they're proposing, the framing of understanding the problems is siloed, that they propose, and then the solutions that they propose are just tiny tweaks on the status quo. So, those of us, if we are or can become an anti-collapse coalition, I think one of our big challenges is to hold the fire to the feet of those who are decision makers, to insist that they grasp the problem at its more deep, at its deeper levels, and not just pass off these superficial tweaks and solutions that really aren't doing anything. For example, there's the whole question of economic growth. That is never challenged in elite circles. Always humanity has to have more resources. We have to have more energy. We have to have more land use constantly in order to keep the profits growing and the returns to investors and government revenues. Those are all good things, but that's what's pushing us toward the cliff. And that's just one example of a sea change in understanding and policy that could have enormous influence. But it's only going to happen if a coalition insists on a shift in understanding and policy.
It just occurred to me, listening to you, Richard, that maybe if this coalition could develop itself and become somewhat aligned, we just go to Davos and we just infiltrate. I mean, somehow there needs to be a conversation at the highest level. So if we were actually able to amass enough alignment amongst enough of us to actually show up at Davos and maybe have some sessions with the people who are at the top of the pyramid, who knows?
And it's at the same, I'm sorry for adding more, but this also needs to be accompanied by a healthy skepticism of the debilitating influence of social power psychologically and morally on those who have it. You know, we assume that if we change the minds of the people in Davos, then they can make all these shifts. But the people in Davos are systemically prevented by their own psychology and their own benefits from really understanding what's going on for everyone else. So we have to maintain a healthy skepticism of their ability to actually get it.
Robert, you got your hand up before, and then David and Stephen.
The problem I've heard is a solution that's gone bad. A problem is a solution that's gone bad. It doesn't work anymore. Well, that's all well and good if you can manage it and it's just affecting you. You can look somewhere else and you're not going to beat yourself over the head by doing the same thing over and over again. You're going to stop and you're going to say, I've got to look at this a different way. Well, what if it's capitalism? What if it's communism? What if it's embedded in the minds of people at Davos? It's not we going to Davos. We just have to listen to those that have always had solutions, that were always innovative, that were and whose land has been taken. And that goes from the Native American to the land that's being taken left and right in the Philippines from farmers. 400 farmers have been killed because they didn't want to yield 15 generations of ownership. Why would they? So to me, it's important to look at how they are functioning in collaboration. They're not thinking of anti-collapse. They're thinking of what do we profoundly want? What do we profoundly want ourselves? If it's only about stopping, then it's not about starting. So there are coalitions that are coming together globally that never existed before. The organization that I chair is just hopefully just one of the examples. It's called A Growing Culture. We've become a platform for something like 500 organizations around the world who are speaking, and we're trying to change the narrative. Now, I'm not trying to highlight this organization as much as make the point that from my perspective, in hearing the heart in what's being spoken here, the great need is to understand how they are working together for the first time. And what are they trying, what do they want? What are they trying to do? We have to sit down and shut up and listen. Because if we do that, we will hear that the largest organization in the world of people is not from the global north. It's really an organization called La Via Campesina, peasants, working all over, everywhere. And now joining forces with women-led organizations in Korea and organizations in Cambodia. I mean, I don't want to keep going because I'm going to cover every continent. And they are communicating with each other all the time about creating a different narrative. And I think how you do that, there's a peasant and indigenous press forum. And that's amazing. So yes. I'll just want to just put that kind of energy into the dialogue as well.
David, I know you've had your hand up. I'm going to call on Allison to respond to that because that seems to be pertinent. Thank you, Robert.
Yes, thank you so much, John. And Robert, I really love your thinking there. And as you know, as you were talking, I was tying threads to, the way that perhaps what needs to happen is we need to really change our worldview to make the kind of changes that we're talking about. We need to move away from this materialist thinking, whether it's capitalism or communism, to a post-materialist understanding of our world and each other. And I think in doing that, this means that life, our understanding of life, will take on a very different meaning for each of us, a life of value and meaning as opposed to a life of inputs and outputs. So I just say that as we think about confronting power, it's going to mean that we need to shift our worldview to confront that power structure. So tying again into what Robert was saying, I found that very inspirational. So thank you for sharing.
And I would just reference that, how do we think about the forum to do that? What is the forum, maybe out of some of these conversations, to actually confront what needs to change, but a forum for your voices. David's had his hand up, and then Stephen, and then Tatiana.
So I want to apologize first if I overgeneralize. Anyone who doesn't fit this generalization, please accept my apologies. Just about everyone in this room, I'm just assuming by your job titles, mine, formal one as well, has a pension, maybe has some savings, and we're able to go off into the future. We have college funds. We go off into the future, assuming that economic growth, the growth of our pension fund and the growth of our savings will be enough to cover us in our old age. No matter how many vegetable burgers I eat, it will not overcome the damage caused by my pension fund in any single day. I own, but I don't control, but I own oil companies. I own companies. I talked about the Congo. I talked about the companies that are owning and working with the child slaves, Tesla, HP, Microsoft, Google. These are all the folks that make cell phones and all the folks who make electric cars, and Apple. And my pension fund, when they do great, my pension fund does great, and my self-esteem increases. And I'm feeling good about myself because I'm taking care of myself and my family. Folks, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Nancy, if I were to have a talk with you, we would talk about John Woolman and inheritance. I've taught a class on that. What role does inheritance have? My friends in sub-Saharan Africa and India don't have any inheritances. I mean, that's a non-thing. But I know that the power in this room, among the power that exists in this room, is we all have pension funds. We all have savings. We all prepare for our futures in a world that will collapse. And we're going down as willing victims of this collapse. And not only that, we're fueling it.
And one of the things that's come to my mind, also having a pension and a SEPAR and whatnot, is how do we control who we support in that? And how are those firms contributing to our problem? Tatiana, I'm going to call on you, and then Stephen, if you will. Tatiana.
So I am resonating with what David just said, that all this illusion of prosperity and comfort and safety of the Western world will collapse, and indeed it is collapsing. And from economic standpoint, and my first education was in economics and finance, it is unstoppable. It's just a matter of time. We are in the process of this system just breaking down. Then the question becomes, so what can help us go through the storm? What will be left, or what is left? This is not just an ecological crisis. There's so many of this crisis modalities just piling up, and they just manifest. It's a systemic issue. It's a perfect storm. So what can we learn right now to start helping each other without waiting for people in Davos or any corporation, any big names, government leaders, so-called leaders, because that leadership is also collapsing. What can we do? How can we learn from these people who survived, who went through the storms already in other communities, in indigenous communities, in other countries. We know the stories of resilience and surviving and revitalizing communities and not depending on a huge inflow of money, on living just on $1 a day, David mentioned. That's possible. Some people do it and they still survive and sometimes thrive. And maybe they use non-monetary ways to do things, to accomplish things, to help each other. And as Alice mentioned yesterday, what can we learn from just interviewing a person and hearing them as a book and learning from an open book? And here I am recalling my own story. I went through collapse of USSR. Our savings were gone, but there were other means to survive. We had a garden, we had a family, we had community, we had families and relatives who were helping each other. We were living without money for years because this money were not paid until 6-12 months later. So how is this possible? And it's possible somehow. So what if many of us who are still embedded in this Western worldview take widen our view a little bit, that there's something we don't know. Can we learn from other people, from other cultures, from other worldviews, and start learning now, start inviting these people, or going there and saying, we want to learn from you, let's sit with you, let's hear your story. Maybe I can learn something, maybe I can adjust the way I live right now so I'm not dependent on those pensions, thinking that these pensions will sustain me. Or maybe I'm not gonna be buying yachts, because I live in Montenegro right now. And let me tell you, I never knew how expensive the yachts could be. And there are so many yachts in Montenegro from people from New York that park a $50 million yacht there. However, right there in Africa, we cannot solve a simple water distribution problem, right? So, sorry, it's going a little bit long. This is my few cents.
Yeah. So Stephen, you've had your hand up. Can you give us a quick thought from you?
You're up.
Yeah, what? I didn't know I had my hand up. Was that?
Oh, yeah, I saw you wave, but let me go to Linda.
Yeah,
and,
I don't think it wasn't intentional. Sorry.
Okay, all right, sorry. Linda.
I really just want to recognize that Miranda Haskey is here, and I'd like to recognize that she's on our panel. If you'd like to unmute yourself and show us